From the Library of Congress in Washington, D.C.
Well, hello everyone. My name is Melanie Polutta, and I'm here with...
I'm Tim Carlton, Senior Instructor in the Library of Congress, Cooperative Instructional Programs Division.
And we are here to accompany the video we have already done on cataloger's judgment and the statement of responsibility. We'd like to work through some examples which you're going to be seeing on the screen and discuss how these different examples are related to the issues that we talked about in our presentation.
Let me first say, before you get into the first example, as we discussed in that video, there's a lot of room for cataloger judgment. So we're not prescribing the one way to do it. I know catalogers often want to know what is the right way. I often tell them when I teach them there's not a right way. There are often wrong ways, but there's not one right way. And so we're going to show an example of how you might transcribe a statement of responsibility or the multiple statements of responsibility, but that is by no means necessarily the one and only way to do it. So keep that in mind.
But we will mark what is the minimum requirement.
And what you would think about. What do you need to think about in each of these cases?
So our first one has the phrase, Tim Mormon, and then separated by a little bit of space, illustrated by Raffaele Ruggeri. I hope I pronounced that right. So in this case, we would definitely, without any question, record Tim Mormon, because that is my judgment, the first recorded statement of responsibility, both by layout and by the fact that it's bolded.
Correct.
Then comes the optional addition, illustrated by Raffaele Ruggeri. Now it's clear they're doing different roles, so I can leave off that second one, especially since he's also separated by layout, so I would think of it as a separate and second statement of responsibility, which means that one is optional.
Right. Right. I mean, a couple things here. And first of all, you would want to confirm that Tim Mormon does actually have something to do with the intellectual artistic content.
True.
One would assume that from this situation, from what you see here, but there is no statement of function. So in a case like this, you want to confirm that he is indeed the author. I do want to point out also that if this were a resource intended for children, and one would think this topic is not, except for perhaps extremely prodigious children, that the statement of responsibility for the illustrator is not required. There is some confusion about that. You would be required to give an access point for Raffaele, but you don't have to necessarily include the statement of responsibility. In this case, pretty clearly that is not a statement, a resource intended for children.
Well, then we can look at the next one, the case of the groaning ghost, and say this is probably for children.
I would think so.
So how many statements would you say are there?
I would say this is pretty clearly three statements. You have a by, you have an illustrated by, and you have color illustrations. And so clearly the statements are indicating function. There is a separation of function. There is actually kind of a separation, I would say, on non-linkage by typography, is that the by James Preller is in bigger font. They all seem to be using the same font face and slightly bolded. Right. So how many statements is this? This is pretty clearly three statements. How many would I give? I'm only required to give the first one that is related to the intellectual artistic content, and that would be by James Preller. So the semicolon illustrated by Jamie Smith, semicolon cover illustration by R.W. Alley are both optional. As you mentioned in the preceding video, you could decide to pick and choose and leave one or more of those out. If you do give them, I just point out the ISBD punctuation has not changed, and you would include a space, semicolon, space separating the statements of responsibility.
Yes, which is what we are following still currently in our MARC records. Now, this next one has I would look at it and possibly be able to argue one statement of responsibility. Others might not because of the word with.
Yeah, well, with is always problematic, of course. With what? Well, here it tells you with what. So I guess I would tend to say that this is multiple statements grammatically connected. And what that decision affects is, do you include a semicolon before the with a forward or not? I would definitely not include a semicolon after McPherson, because the and there, and has to be connected with what comes before it. That's the idea of that particular conjunction. Yeah, strong grammatical connection. With is not as strong a grammatical connection. So I would say you have two statements of responsibility here, and I would record them as such with a semicolon after junior, space, semicolon, space, and then the other elements run together in one statement. But if you decided to run them all together with no semicolons, that would be fine too. The advantage to treating them as two is that you could get away with just simply edited by Samuel C. Hyde Jr., period, done, move on to the next element.
Yes, and forward and afterward, once again, cataloger's judgment.
Right,
How
right.
important is their role? Do you
Right,
really need to
right.
record them?
And we aren't talking here about access points.
No,
So for
absolutely
all
not.
three of those persons, you would decide whether to give them access points. That doesn't necessarily depend on whether you record them in the statement of responsibility.
And I would add that there's the slight layout differentiation that would encourage me to regard them as two statements,
Right, and I was
because
looking
there's a
at that too.
separation
Right,
between
right.
the edited by statement and the with a forward.
Right, and that's kind of what I meant about the typographical non-linkage.
Well, and here we have, I guess you could call it a variation on that aspect, an edited by statement with two names, and then a with a forward by with one name. So once again, there is a separation that is in layout. So would I regard these as one or two? I would probably regard these as two statements of responsibility. Would you agree?
I agree with that. The with a forward, there's a specific indication of the role. So first of all, you don't have to record the with a forward by. You would need to record both editors. And another thing here, which we haven't seen yet, but RDA does instruct you to add clarifying punctuation.
Yes,
In
that's an
other
important
words,
point to bring
if
out here.
in here to make the point that the editors are two separate persons. It is not one person named James A. Green, Christopher P.M. Waters. So
That would be a really
to
long
indicate
name.
that, to make that clear, you add a comma, and
Yes.
that's simply called clarifying punctuation.
Yes. And that is...
Would you think about including the dame in this case?
Well, once again, that I think would go back to how important is she, how long is that forward? There have been forwards that are lengthy and of significance, so I might be inclined to add that, but I wouldn't necessarily be inclined to give her an access point.
What about if you record the statement? Are you going to abridge the term dame?
I would not, because to me, although yes, I could drop that, it's not part of her name, but it's not like it's a lengthy addition.
I would take exactly the same argument. Exactly.
So it simplifies that decision.
Right.
So our next one is 1001 low-fat vegetarian recipes. Do you need any of your new recipes?
No, it's certainly not vegetarian recipes. No, I'm a meat and potatoes guy.
So our statement of responsibility here, to me, this looks like one. It does have the unifying with, it does have the separation of typography, bolded versus non-bolded, but it's all there in one single line.
Right.
Would you be inclined to regard that as one or two?
I think this one is less clear than some of them we've seen before. There is the, as you point out, the typographical difference, but we don't, typography doesn't rule the world.
No.
So we
It's an
don't have
indicator.
to, obviously we're not going to choose different fonts in our catalog record depending on how it was recorded in the resource, at least not with the current systems.
No.
A couple questions here. What the heck did Sue Spittler do? I would wonder, first of all, just from seeing cookbooks, did she really author 1001 recipes, or is she actually the editor here?
Or
Now,
compiler.
or a compiler, indeed, of recipes put together by a lot of different people. I actually have examined this, and it does appear that she is the author. If she were not, then I might want to bracket in compiled by Sue Spittler to make that point clear that this person does not have the role that you would assume the person has from looking at the title page. The with Linda R. Yoakum, I don't know. Again, with is such a fuzzy connection. I would probably record it as one statement. I don't know what Linda Yoakum has done. She's got some degrees there, which probably make, I think RD is something,
Registered dietitian.
dietitian. That's what I thought that was.
But MS, I'm not sure.
Masters of Science,
Okay.
yes. And so she's probably, I don't know, she's giving medical advice to the recipe writer? I don't know.
All things are possible.
I don't know. I could go either way on that. Another question is here: are you going to record the RD and the MS?
Certainly, that could be dropped because that is an abridgment that is offered to us.
Right. Then that again, abridgment, not an omission. You have judgment there, as you mentioned on the earlier one. It isn't like that's going to take you a long time to type RDMS.
No, it certainly is an encouragement to leaving it there. Well, now let's look at this next example that is the players of Shakespeare, and we're looking at an entire phrase, essays in Shakespearean performance by 12 players with the Royal Shakespeare Company. Is that all a statement of responsibility?
Well, this is a situation that we call a noun phrase. We're looking here specifically at the words essays in Shakespearean performance. By is pretty clearly a statement of responsibility.
Yes.
Essays in Shakespearean performance, and this is a change from AACR 2, in which case you would have to determine, is that phrase indicative of the contents, the nature of the contents, or the role and function of the entities named in it? And it's just simply much clearer in the case of RDA in a good way, which is that if you are in doubt, record it as a statement of responsibility. So under RDA, the essays in Shakespearean performance by would all be after the slash in the C subfield. I will note that any of you that actually happen to look up the old records for these, was a series of books, and under AACR 2 they were done with the essays in Shakespearean performance in the other title information in a B subfield, followed by slash C subfield by 12 players. Mm-hmm. So this is an area where there has been a change in RDA, and I think it's a good change, which is that in case of doubt, don't agonize.
Yes, that simplifies the decision-making process.
I asked one of our experts for help on one of this, and he basically answered my question. He didn't even really look at the title page. I told him it was a situation of a noun phrase, and he said, "Are you in doubt?" I said, "Yeah." He said, "There's your answer."
Oh, okay.
So
that makes it a lot simpler.
Yes, indeed.
And here's an interesting point, that it is by 12 players, not by people's names.
Yeah, remember we said that there's no requirement that a statement of responsibility name actual persons, families, or corporate bodies. It can certainly refer to them, as this one does here. Mm-hmm. You have a second statement of responsibility here, edited by Philip Brockbank, which does name a person. It also includes an affiliation. If you decide to record that, and I would in this case, especially because there are no persons named as the creators.
Mm-hmm. But that is an exercise of your judgment.
That's an exercise of my judgment. I would tend to record it. That does not mean I would give an access point for Brockbank, of course. Those are different decisions.
Yes.
And I would probably leave off the affiliation, but that too is my exercise of judgment. Mm-hmm. All of this is part of the generally.
Yes, and if I wanted to give access to those people's names, perhaps I could do it in something like a contents note.
Indeed.
Or just a general note that lists the name of the 12 players, if I can find them.
Correct. Yes, indeed. You could definitely do a contents note in this kind of a situation, if those essays are credited.
Yes.
In other words, you know who wrote what.
Yes.
In other words, this is a good example of a compilation, not a collaboration,
yes,
because you do know who wrote which piece. Mm-hmm. All right, let me let's look at this one. You have this work in French that lists numerous auteurs, and then you have numerous people who have collaborated. Mm-hmm. And first of all, how many statements of responsibility would you consider this, and what of those would you record?
Well, this one actually has 3 statements of responsibility, because when you looked at the example, you saw the 2 big clumps of names, but there's actually one above that which has 2 names, and in parentheses the statement of their role, directors. So that one to me is the first one that indicates some kind of intellectual responsibility. Okay. So certainly that one is the one that's required. So that would be required. Now, the other ones are not required, so those are completely optional, but they are also quite lengthy. Both listings are 12 names. The first one are authors, the second ones are collaborators. And you can see here, descending order of importance here. Authors are more important than collaborators, so if I had to leave one off, I'd obviously leave off the third one. But I would definitely want to include the second one. But at the same time, this is a lot of names. This is one where I would reach my break point on how many names to record and do the option of omitting.
I agree.
So I would drop the 11 names and add in the statement of omission and 11 others.
Mm-hmm. And my quandary when I would do this, my first quandary would be, do I record that in English or in French or perhaps in Spanish, since the work is published in Barcelona? But I know from what you said earlier that because you are supplying an element here, you add it in the language of the cataloging agency.
So in this case, I added it in English, even though the text of the work is in French.
Which looks incongruous, but nevertheless, that is the
standard. And in this case, I recorded it as numerals.
Indeed.
And I don't think there's a requirement.
Yeah, RDA does not specify whether the 11 is 11 or ELEVEN.
So I don't think that there's a rule there. Now, in the next example, we do have just 2 authors listed, but
a lot of stuff about those 2 authors.
yes, the statement of responsibility here can get quite lengthy because in each of them we're indicating their position as professor, as head of a division, and the affiliation to a specific university. So this can get a very long statement of responsibility, even though there's just 2 people mentioned here.
Right.
This tends to happen, I noticed, in medical books.
Right, yes, indeed.
Which this is.
Yeah.
So this is one where I could abridge quite a bit by putting just 2 people's names. Elijah Saunders, Wallace R. Johnson, separated by that clarifying punctuation, which you mentioned, of a comma. On the other hand, it's perfectly acceptable to list it all. And in a sense, that also is an exercise of your cataloger's judgment because you're saying, well, I think it's important to record who and what they are because this is medical work. I want to show their credentials since they are presenting them to us.
Right. And pretty clearly this is one statement. There's no distinction in functions. There's only 2 of them.
Yes, and layout and presentation gives them equal responsibility.
Right, the clarification of the role, of the separation, excuse me.
Yes, there is no mention of role, so that is something, if I really wanted to, I could add.
Yes.
I don't think it's really necessary.
No.
In this case, they're both authors, so I don't feel that that needs clarification. But this is an example of something that could be shortened a lot.
Definitely. And remember, the statement of responsibility is not a biography of Elijah and Wallace. A lot of this information, I think, probably should go into the authority record that this person is at the University of Maryland School of Medicine. And actually, they're both at the same school.
Yes.
But it does not need to, you are not writing a book, you're not writing a biography in the statement of responsibility.
This I would record in that authority record because it would contribute to breaking conflicts. Because here I'm recording something about their occupation and field of activity. So that would certainly help me in those fundamental Ferber tasks of authorities, which is find and identify.
Right.
So in that case, yes, that absolutely would go in the authority record regardless of whether or not I recorded it in the statement of responsibility.
And even in that, in the question of abridgment, there is some judgment. For example, I might want to point out the person is that each of these persons is a medical doctor, but not necessarily, for example, to add credibility. In other words, these are not football players writing a book about hypertension. Why would I care to read what they say? But maybe I don't need to point out the affiliation. And so you have judgment. You could keep the degrees and leave off the affiliation. You can kind of pick and choose that as well. Yeah, it doesn't say you can't. So something here, I'm sorry, this is off the topic for what we're discussing here, but it's relevant to something we've talked about in other discussions, which is that this addition statement here. And what would you do about that, third edition?
I would record it as given, THIRD, yes, that is NEDITION, no abbreviations.
Correct. When we taught some catalogers at LC, there was some confusion. No abbreviations, no abbreviations. Well, it's that you do not abbreviate. But so there, if it appears spelled out, you leave it spelled out. If it's abbreviated, you abbreviate it. You record it as you see it.
Yep. Okay, well, we hope that these examples have been helpful to you, and certainly they, I think, clarify or show what we've been discussing with great clarity.
This has been a presentation of the Library of Congress. Visit us at loc.gov.